You are listening to Rooted to Earth, a SAE Innova podcast.
There are people out there who are making significant investments in what they're doing that are taking note of the environment, taking note of their carbon footprint and taking note of their impact on biodiversity. And on a much more local level, just in Kent, I've been really keen to make sure that we talk to farmers, because farmers are the people who own the land. They're the ones who have the biggest impact on what our landscape looks like and what animals and flowers and birds can exist within it. If somebody spent 20 million quid a year on advertising nature, it would have a massive difference, because you've got that kind of marketing budget behind it to be able to buy ad space, to be able to do creative things, rather than being reliant on organic growth and people being interested in finding out about it.
This is a space for real conversations, from farmers and scientists to community leaders and innovators, each of them working to bring nature back into balance. This is Rooted to Earth. Welcome to episode 6 of Rooted to Earth. Today we are joined by Rob Smith, a seasoned journalist and broadcaster with over 25 years of experience at the BBC, where he spent more than a decade presenting the main evening news programme for Kent and Sussex. Through his work hosting the Kent Wildlife Trust podcast, Talk on the Wild Side, Rob has been documenting remarkable transformations in British agriculture. His conversations reveal a landscape of practical solutions, showcasing how traditional farming can evolve to better serve both people and the planet. Today, we will be exploring the role of media in environmental communication, the power of long-form storytelling in addressing complex issues like climate change, and the inspiring stories Rob has encountered of people making real, tangible changes in their local communities. So join us for this conversation about journalism and environmental transformation. Hi, Rob. Thank you for joining Rooted to Earth.
Well, pleasure to be here. Pleasure to meet you.
How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. I'm in sunny, at the moment, Kent. So Kent is just to the east of London in the UK, and it's a big farming part of the UK. You've got a lot of urban areas in it as well. It's a real sort of mixture of things. And looking out the window today, we've got beautiful blue skies.
So I'm still in the few sunny minutes of you just while recording this interview. You have worked for more than 25 years at the BBC and as a journalist, right?
That's true, yes. Yeah, I started off in commercial radio in about 1994, and then I joined the BBC in 95, thereabouts. And I was in radio as a reporter and a presenter through until the early 2000s, and swapped over to telly as a TV reporter and then presenter. I spent 11 years presenting the main 6:30 evening news programme for Kent and Sussex, which is a regional TV news programme. And then I actually left the BBC in 2020, end of 2020. So that was just after the first lockdowns had finished, and just as we were going into the second set of lockdowns. So that was it was an interesting time to to leave a big organisation and start doing stuff on your own. But yes, I've been paddling my own canoe for the last 4 years and doing all sorts of interesting random bits and pieces since then.
I suppose you had time during the second round of lockdown to think about rethink about your profession, your role.
Yeah. I think, having been in news for a long time, and a big part of the reason why we're having a conversation is around sort of all the green related stuff, obviously. And I've been deeply concerned about the state of the world in general for a number of years. My kids at that point, so they're sort of 21 and 19 now, but you go back 10 years when they were just turning from little children into going to secondary school kind of thing, and looking at the world that we're in and the world that they would be growing up in, there was an awful lot of stuff that I was kind of deeply concerned about. In the UK, if you go back 10 years ago, we're in the middle of austerity programs still following the financial crash. So there was a lot of stuff going on in government that, as a news person, you're constantly exposed to thinking about all of this stuff on a daily basis. And over time, that's quite toxic. It starts wearing you down, starts making you quite miserable about all sorts of things. And I was really starting to get more interested in trying to find out um, answers to some of those big questions about are are people in key areas actually taking this stuff seriously? Are things starting to actually happen that are meaningful, that are going to take the climate crisis and the environment crisis seriously? Or are we just heading in such a terrible direction that things are all just going to fall apart? So when I left the BBC, the one thing I knew that I didn't want to do was go straight back into news, because that was going to just be putting my head back in the vice kind of thing. So I did exactly that. I took a few weeks, few months to try and figure out what kind of things I wanted to do, and more importantly, the kind of things that I didn't want to do. A lot of people who've worked as journalists and broadcasters will immediately go into PR, for instance, for a big organization. And I've got friends who've gone and worked for, companies like Shell, for instance, or, other big organizations where they can see that you have got those skills that they can use to lobby effectively on their behalf. And I realized I didn't want to do that. That wasn't the game that I wanted to play. And so I've kind of tried to find uh, different ways of working with lots of different organizations, but fundamentally to try, if I can, to be working with and alongside people who are doing positive things for the environment and for society, broadly speaking, and to try and trumpet some of the good things that people are doing, because I think you need an antidote, a credible antidote to the negative stuff that you'll see in the news on a regular basis, to try and overcome some of those, I think, completely legitimate anxieties about the state of the world.
After all these years of experience, what is your view on how mass media and broadcast has been addressing climate change?
Well, I think that some organizations take it really seriously. So, The Guardian, for instance, is a newspaper, regularly puts climate change stuff on its front pages, and regularly it's taken a big commitment towards climate change stuff. In the UK, Channel 4 will regularly put climate change stuff much higher up the agenda. But in general terms, the BBC does do climate related stuff, but it tends to be kind of lower down the order in bulletins. It'll tend to be within the kind of science space of things rather than being a story. I have noticed in the last couple of years, so with the floods in Valencia, for instance, there was an overt link being made in lots of bulletins, in lots of outlets, between what's happened in Valencia and climate change, in a way that I think maybe 5 years ago wouldn't, that kind of link wouldn't have been made quite so explicitly. So it's changing and it's shifting, but it's still not quite regarded as like the main story. The main story is Trump. The main story is Putin. The main story is, I don't know, if there was a prison riot happened somewhere, whatever it is. There's the traditional news stories are events that happen on the day that are big and exciting. And if you're going to get pictures of stuff, that is always going to kind of get onto the front pages of things. And of course, the problem with the climate crisis and the environmental crisis is it happens in slow motion. You can't see the disappearance. If a percentage change in the number of insects happens over 20 years, it's not an easy thing to show in real time. And I think that all media outlets struggle with that, because you're competing against so many other things, particularly in that fragmented digital world. Getting those kind of stories around the environment to be interacted, for people to get excited about and to be concerned about and to understand them, is much harder, because you have to find things that are going to compete with those kind of Hollywood celebrity stories because that's where the ad revenue goes. Always follow the money. If the ad revenue is going into a particular place, that's where most of the focus is going to go. And so it's quite difficult, I think, to get some of this environmental stuff higher up the agenda, because people don't get excited about it in quite the same way that they do if they see, a Hollywood A-lister on a page, and they'll just click on it. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, and I was thinking that on your vision of the role of communication in relation to climate change, one thing is what mass media is trying to do, or the agenda they manage, and other thing is as a general term, communication as a tool for trying to transform or to share stories. And I think it's what you are now trying to do with your podcast, and
Yeah.
you shifted from kind of a more formal way of journalism to I think a different perspective, when you can play a different role as a podcast host, right?
Yeah. I mean, I hope that I've still got some degree of credibility with the stuff that I do, having come from that background. Certainly in the area in Kent and Sussex, I've got a degree of profile. People know who I am. So I hope that when people hear me talking about environmental stuff on the podcast, they understand that I'm bringing the same level of kind of intellectual rigor and journalistic credibility to that as I ever did when I was on the telly or when I was on the radio. The podcast for me is really useful to have longer form conversations. So like we're having a chat now, on the telly, in a half-hour news program, you'll have 8 stories, and there'll be a maximum of 2 minutes each. So you have to really, really super distill everything down into a kind of concentrated, packaged format for that to be able to happen. And in that context, it totally makes sense. But what you lose then is nuance. What you lose is the opportunity to have a bit more of a vigorous debate about something, or say, hey, well, hang on a minute, you just said this, and probably come back on them and get people to explain what they mean around stuff. So the podcast gives me the opportunity to do that. If I'm going to go and talk to people with Kent Wildlife Trust around, okay, so one of the big things that's happening at the moment is the National Grid, who is the electricity supply operator, at the moment, they are planning on putting in a new undersea cable that is going to come ashore in Kent through a place called Pegwell Bay, which is it's a Ramsar site. It's internationally recognized as a place for wetland birds and overwintering migrating birds and those kind of things. It's a triple SI, which is a site of special scientific interest. It's a special protection area. It's a marine conservation zone. It's theoretically the most protected landscape you can possibly have. But they're going to put a cable through the middle of it, and they're going to build a converter station and the connector station for the 2 bits of electricity to join up, kind of thing, on the marshes next to Pegwell Bay. The building's going to be 100 foot high. It's going to have a footprint the size of Wembley Stadium. And that's going to happen. So it's one of these things where it's like, okay, how are you going to mitigate for that? And within the context of the podcast, I've spoken to the Wildlife Trust. I've spoken to people who live locally. I've spoken to a gamekeeper. So he works on a farmland in the area, and his job is to manage the land for shooting for, game birds and that kind of thing. So he's got a different perspective on it as well. And I've spoken to National Grid. And when I spoke to National Grid, the conversation with them lasts about quarter of an hour, 20 minutes. And we ask that question, this is the most protected area that you can have, and you're going to put it out. Why is that going to happen? And then they go on to explain that they're going to attempt to put all these mitigation measures in and whatever. But you don't get the opportunity to have the kind of nuanced conversation around that in a 2-minute TV thing, because it becomes kind of like finger pointy. And so that's why I find it an interesting space to put it in. And the other thing that I find interesting around podcasting is the fact that it's got a much longer life than the news cycle. The conversation we're having now, it's not one of those things where you put it out there and if you don't get an immediate audience on it, you kind of go, well, nobody listened to that and you bin it. It sits on your podcast library, I don't know, forever. So the conversation we have now, people might be listening to this in 5 years' time, in 2030, somebody might listen back to this. You're more concerned about how many people will listen to it over time, and you build an audience over time, and people will listen to one episode and go, well, that was an interesting conversation. And then they'll go back and listen to previous ones. Podcasting and modern digital broadcasting kind of stuff like this is got an almost infinite library that's just there for you to go back and explore at any point. And I think that that's really valuable because for people who are really interested in a particular subject, and once you become attuned to the fact that you want to find out more about the climate crisis and the nature situation, you'll seek stuff out and you'll find those interesting conversations. You'll find those nuanced conversations and take the time to listen to them because they're important to you.
We're talking about Talk on the Wild Side, Kent Wildlife Trust podcast that you are hosting. How do you feel when you hear these stories? You were mentioning before your curiosity and your observation about what's happening outside there in your own region. You know, just in another country or in another city, it's just around you. So what do you feel when you hear these stories and when you found out what's happening and what people is doing for making a real change in their places?
So my broad brush answer is I'm much more positive now than I was a few years ago, because what I have come to realize is that there are a lot of people out there who are really concerned, and there are a lot of really bright, articulate, intelligent, powerful people who are pushing hard to try and make things better, who do get it. And whatever you look at the Trump situation in America, and it's quite frightening. Lots of the things that are being talked about that might be changing. When the guy who's going to be president of the United States says "drill, baby, drill," it's like, oh my God, this is somebody who not only doesn't understand what the climate crisis is, but is aggressively wanting to add to it. Which is crazy. But underneath all of that, that there are huge numbers of people who genuinely do get it and who are already doing lots of stuff to mitigate against that kind of thing. So going back a couple of years, I was involved in having conversations. We did a sort of documentary series around decarbonisation in shipping. I spoke to lots of people in, the head of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, the British Chamber of Shipping, the British Ports Authority, people in finance, people in insurance, all sorts of different layers of the shipping industry. And all of them were talking around how to make decarbonisation happen in the shipping industry. Not whether it should happen, not whether it was a waste of time and the climate thing was a hoax, all kinds of things that you would probably have heard 15 years ago having those conversations. They were all saying, we know it's going to happen. We just need clarity in how to make it happen. Because as an organization, we've got to get the rules in place for what is going to be acceptable going forward. We don't want to have class actions against us for pumping, heavy sulfur oil particles into the sky. So we're getting away from all that. We just need clarity of regulation to make it happen. Well, that for me was like a real penny drop moment, because these are the serious players. When you're talking about shipping companies like Maersk, for instance, committing to build 5 new container ships that will not be fueled by heavy oil, which would have been the default thing to do a few years ago, but they're looking 25, 30 years down the road, the life of that ship. They don't want to have to change the fuel again because that's expensive. They don't want to get sued for producing new ships that are going to be polluting and carbon heavy. They also want to make sure that they don't miss out on contracts with companies like Amazon, for instance, who say we want to have a smaller carbon footprint. So as part of that, if you're running a ship that is polluting, then you're not going to win the contract to bring Amazon goods around the world. So hearing those kind of people making those kind of commitments makes you think, well, whatever Trump says, this is happening. There are people out there who are making significant investments in what they're doing that are taking note of the environment, taking note of their carbon footprint, and taking note of their impact on biodiversity. And on a much more local level, just in Kent, I've been really keen to make sure that we talk to farmers, because farmers are the people who own the land. They're the ones who have the biggest impact on what our landscape looks like and what animals and flowers and birds can exist within it. So I've been to a farm that's 3,000 acres. So it's about 1,500 hectares, something like that. That is switching over to regenerative farming. It's an arable farm, so they grow wheat is their primary crop. They were, until the last 5 years, doing the sort of the classic farming thing of high inputs, lots of nitrates, lots of pesticides, spraying the field on a calendar basis, because that's what you do, that's what you did. They've started switching over stuff, and they are finding that their yields haven't changed significantly, and their inputs, the amount of money they're having to spend on farming that land, have dropped dramatically. So you're not spending £80,000 a year on fertilizer, and you're not losing much yield in having made the change. So you actually make more profit, which is like, oh, well, that's a big tick, isn't it? That makes it way, way easier for other farmers around them to look at them and go, well, hang on a minute, do I really want to be spending £80,000 a year just on nitrates or whatever those inputs are, when they seem to be able to do it, still make a profit, and their hedgerows look prettier and they've got birds and stuff. I used to love it when there were birds in the fields. It'd be nice if I could do that. It kind of allows that argument to happen in a different way, but you need those kind of pioneers, if you like, to take those first steps and show that it is possible to do that, to do things on a commercial basis, a robust basis, and yet still produce the crops, feed people, and make some money. And if you can do those things at the same time, and they are, so it's Nonnington Farm is that particular one, just east of Canterbury. If you can do that, then it's like, well, there's hope there for finding different ways of doing things. So that was a very long-winded answer to say, yes, I'm much more hopeful now than I was, because I think there are people who are actively making changes.
While I was listening to you, I was thinking, okay, you had the opportunity to meet this story. So this is the power, the role of communication itself. So
Totally, yeah.
what challenges or what do you think is the main challenge facing this role of making topics like regenerative agriculture relatable for audience who may not have a farming background or never listened to the concept of regenerative agriculture before?
Yeah, I think they're kind of there's two things, and they're both to do with money. The first is that the amount of money available for me, for instance, making the podcast for Kent Wildlife Trust is tiny. So I'm doing this as a passion project more than anything. I'd still do work for other businesses and organizations and companies because I've got to pay the mortgage still. And so finding sources of income for communicating this stuff is difficult. It's an issue around how do you get nature to sponsor things, because nature just gets on with it. So you have to find people who are willing to stump up on nature's behalf. And lots of people, if you can't make money directly from it, then it's difficult to give money to other people. So that's part of the problem. The other side of the coin is that all the big oil companies, all the big supermarkets, all the big retail outlets, their commercial interest is in selling whatever their product is, and they spend lots of money on marketing and promoting their products and produce. And so you're not just competing for interest on a level playing field. It's that I've got a tiny little speaker that I'm through, and they've got this huge massive PA system that they're broadcasting on that is really fully funded. And they spend a huge amount of that money on getting really bright, articulate, intelligent, creative people to come up with those ads to sell stuff. Now, if you could find somebody with the budget of Tesco's or Exxon or, name a big corporation, if somebody spent 20 million quid a year on advertising nature, it would have a massive difference, because you've got that kind of marketing budget behind it to be able to buy ad space, to be able to do creative things rather than being reliant on organic growth and people being interested in finding out about it. So I think that's the fundamental thing. It comes down to money, and we're not on a level playing field to communicate this stuff.
Having listened to many stories yet, what's do you think the biggest barrier that prevents farmers from embracing more sustainable practices?
I think there's a generational shift is happening in any case. So the people who grew up as farmers in the 1980s, who were part of that sort of revolutionary step change where all of a sudden their yields increased massively, their profits increased significantly. You could get paid by governments to rip out hedgerows and have bigger fields, and bigger fields meant you needed bigger machinery. And so there was a whole big cyclical push to make sure that farming got bigger, more industrialized, more concentrated, fewer people working on the land to produce more stuff. All of those kind of economies of scale things on a straightforward business level absolutely make sense. And so for lots of farmers, they grew up in that environment, and that's how you farm. That's how if you want to be a good farmer, you don't want to see weeds in your fields. You just want to see that one crop. You want to be able to get it all in very quickly. You want to be able to dry it and do whatever it is with that crop you need to do to process it. And you want it to be as efficient as you can to hit all those targets. That's how people farmed successfully for 20, 30 years. And that's quite a big habit to change. And for people coming through who are saying, well, I don't want to do it like that, I want to do it in a more nature-friendly way, you look weirdly out of step from the way that everybody else is doing it. And people as human beings, being out of step with everybody else is quite a difficult thing to do. It's quite, to make yourself an individual against the pack is you make yourself a target. And I think that for lots of farmers, being in a situation where they would have to be the first one to break ranks and to do things differently is just socially really difficult. When you meet with your other farming mates at the county show and you say, actually, I've decided to go down the route of regenerative farming and I'm not going to till anymore and I'm not going to put stuff on. And they'll be like, well, Ted's gone mental, That's the kind of the first conversation that they're going to have to deal with. And I think that's the tricky bit, is finding those kind of pioneer people who are brave enough to do that. So Nonnington Farm is a brilliant example of that. They are doing it. They are making money. They're not weirdos. And that is still a properly commercially run organization. That makes it way, way easier for any of the neighboring farmers to go, do you know what? I never liked using pesticides in the first place. I used to like it when we had birds in the fields. I used to like it when we had more hedgerows in the stuff. I remember when my granddad was here, he'd talk about how it used to be completely different back in the 50s. I'd actually like to have some of that. When you hear from somebody else who's done it that it is possible to do it and you're not the weirdo anymore, that I think is the key thing that allows more landowners to do it. There's another set of sort of specific issues that the UK is going to have to deal with over the next few years now, because the government in the UK has just announced it's changing the law on inheritance tax for farms. So landowners used to be effectively exempt from inheritance tax in the UK. And they've changed it now that only farms under £1 million will be exempt for inheritance tax. Well, once you take into, how much is a combine harvester? £200,000? They're colossally expensive bits of kit. How much is a barn? How much is just a house? And then you've got 1,000 acres. That's way, way more in assets and stuff on the land than £1 million. That means that when you look to pass it on, you're going to have to effectively break up the farm or find a colossal amount of cash in inheritance tax duties going forward. So there's going to be massive changes in land ownership over the course of the next 20 years. As people die, they struggle with paying the inheritance tax bill, and where that is all going to go. My concern around that is that what will happen is that smaller farms, where you've got independent people who can make those kind of decisions about not pulling up a hedgerow, will become increasingly rare. And the really big landowners, who are commercial companies and don't worry about inheritance tax because it's not owned by a person passing it on, it's owned by a business, and the business just rumbles on forever, they'll just hoover it up and hoover it up and hoover it up. And you'll get effectively a kind of supermarketization of the countryside. So that's my kind of big concern at the moment. I haven't really started to properly address that with the podcast yet and to talk some of those issues through. But I think that's an issue that we all need to be aware of, that as soon as you've got a big commercial organization that is in charge of things, all the people within it are powerless to change its direction easily. It's got to come from the top of that organization. You've got to have a CEO who believes in changing it for the whole organization to change.
Rob, where do we find your podcast?
Just search for Talk on the Wild Side and Rob Smith, Kent Wildlife Trust, any of those things. It's on Spotify and Apple Play and all the other, wherever you get your podcasts from. It's quite easy to find.
You are going to be part of the a session in the European Carbon Farming Summit, the second one that will be held in Dublin, Ireland on March 2025, right?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that, because that's going to be an opportunity to genuinely explore lots of these things, talking to farmers who are already doing this kind of stuff, who are the pioneers, who are the ones who have kind of had to endure the weird looks over the fence from their neighbors and have got through it. I think that's really important, because the fact that this is being taken seriously at intergovernmental level at this kind of summit is massively, massively important, because once you start getting the serious, the power players, the people who can actually make decisions at governmental level to take this stuff seriously, then you can start making significant changes. You can start talking about how you actually put grants in place that are useful for farmers who want to do this kind of thing. Because you have to balance the need between food production. We've all got to eat. You have to, we can't just turn all the fields into rewilding areas, because then you'd have, people starving. I'm not a fan of starving. I still like eating. So I think it's really important for us to find ways of balancing the needs of us human beings as a species to eat and live well, but also to leave space for nature. And this kind of summit, this kind of conversation around how you do that, I think is incredibly important. So I'm really quite excited to be part of that.
What do you think the Rob from the past, when you just started your career, would think that about your participation as a moderator in this summit?
I think I'd be quite pleased. I think, looking forward, I kind of feel in myself quite pleased that I haven't sold out, if that makes sense, that I'm still doing stuff that I believe in and that I'm passionate about. And so I think, I'll give myself a little pat on the back for that.
Thank you for your time and for being here with us today, Rob.
Fernando, it's been an absolute pleasure. Lovely to meet you.
This is Rooted to Earth.